All right, everything is anonymous, so we'll see here. Looks like the overwhelming majority says change it to Monday. We're going to go ahead and move it to Monday. So I know sometimes some people like to get it out of the way on Friday and not have to study over the weekend, but seems like most of you would rather have the extra time to study. I will make the changes on the schedule here. Nothing I think that you really have to worry about. I will let you know of any changes tomorrow after I have made them. All right. So we're going to learn some basics about plants today. And like I said, very content heavy, right? There's a lot of terminology. You have to know the terminology before you can talk about really anything else about plants here. All right. So what are plants? Right? Well, if we're considering plants, right, they're going to be multicellular, right? So they're going to be more than one cell. Right? Let's see if my clicker will work here. There we go. They're going to be photosynthetic most of the time. There's always exceptions to the rule, but the majority of plants will be photosynthetic. So they're going to undergo photosynthesis. They're going to be stationary. So plants are not moving. They don't have legs. They can't just walk to a new spot. Right? They're going to be staying in place. They lack a nervous system, right, or any nervous organs. So we don't have like a brain or a spinal cord or neurons. They lack that system. That doesn't mean they can't perceive the environment around them, right? But they don't have a nervous system like animals or humans, other organisms. And finally, they're going to have cell walls. And cell walls filled with cellulose, right, which is a compound we'll talk about in our class today. But cellulose cell walls, rigid cell walls to them. So that's kind of the main definition of what makes up a plant. But if we have to understand plant biology, like I said, we need to know the terminology, which is what we're going to start with today. Right? So we're going to talk about plant structure and organization, expanding and learning all that terminology that you watched in those videos as kind of a precursor to today's lecture. I really like plant terminology because I think it's interesting and cool. I understand not all of you are a terminology focused person, but we're going to start by just talking about the organization of plants. How are plants organized into a plant, right? Well, they have this structure to them, right? They're going to be made of organs, tissues, and cells, right? So cells being the smallest unit here, right? Many cells together would make up a tissue. Several tissues would make up an organ. And we're going to kind of go through this, and we're going to go through it almost maybe backwards, right? So normally I start small and go big. We're going to start big and go small. So we're going to start by talking about organs, because I think it's the most familiar parts of a plant, right? So organs are several types of tissues together that's going to carry out particular functions, right? So when we think about plant organs, like that video you watched there, we have 3 plant organs. We have roots, we have stems, we have leaves. We can divide these organs into 2 different systems. Right? So you could say we have the root system, which is composed of the roots. Right? And we have the shoot system, which is composed of the leaves and the stems. Right? Now these systems work together. They are interdependent. One cannot function without the other, right? You can't have a plant that's all roots, right? They're not going to be able to photosynthesize. You can't have a plant that is all shoots with stems and leaves and no roots, because they're not going to be able to acquire nutrients, right? So these systems are reliant upon one another for resources. All right, we're going to start by talking about the root system, right? So major functions of roots. And again, these are major functions. There's a lot of minor functions to roots. But they're going to anchor the plant in place. Right? I think I mentioned this on a different lecture here. They're going to keep it in place. They're going to make sure if a big gust of wind comes along, or the animal is walking across it, right? The slightest bit of wind or movement is not going to tear it out of the ground because it's anchored in place by those roots. The roots are responsible for acquiring nutrients, like we talked about yesterday. Okay? So they're going to take up those nutrients from the soils, and then roots in general are going to store resources. Some of them more than others will play a bigger part in storage, right? But all roots will store resources in the roots, and just kind of those resources hang out until the plants really need them, and then they'll become mobilized. Right? So we're anchoring the plant, we're acquiring nutrients, we are storing resources. All right, if we look at some of the terminology of plants here, right, the primary root is going to be the root that first emerges from the seed. Right? So if we look at our image up there, our primary root is the first one coming out. Right? Sometimes this can be called the radical, right? It means the same thing as the primary root. It's the first root that emerges. Beyond that first root, right, once that first root has grown and has established, now we're going to start developing these lateral roots. Right? So we're going to start exploring the soil even further. Right? All these different branching structures off of the roots, those would all be the lateral roots. And some plants, not all plants, but some plants will also have a taproot. Right? And the taproot is going to be the main root that you might see if you pull out a plant out of the ground. This one has a very obvious taproot here. It's larger than the rest. It looks like the main root. Right? It'll develop from that primary root that first started off. Right? Like I said, some plants have taproots, not all, depending on the plant that we're looking at. Sometimes that taproot, beyond just being a large root in the ground, can be a specialized taproot specifically to store food. Right? So it could be a storage root, right, which is also a taproot. So like carrots and radishes, a lot of those types of vegetables are all specialized roots, right? A specialized taproot for storing a lot of resources. Right? So for the plants, this is great because we get to store all the resources, and then maybe the next year, right, use those resources to flower and reproduce. Right? So carrots are a great example here. They'll produce these taproots during the first year, right? And then during the second year, they will actually flower. Now we often don't let them get that far. Right? We'll harvest them the first year so we can eat the carrots. Right? But if we let them grow for a second year, then they would use those resources to flower. With roots, we can also have these specialized root structures called root hairs. Right? So root hairs, and we're looking into a little bit more in depth on some terminology here, are root epidermal cells. We'll talk about epidermal cells, but basically they're the cells that are on the surface of a plant. Right? And so root hairs are basically one of those epidermal cells that have these elongated bits. Right? They're long and skinny. Oftentimes when we see root hairs, it's going to be on the newly grown roots, right? Roots that are freshly produced by the plant, and it kind of looks a little fuzzy, right? Oftentimes, I might be browsing the internet and people might post something and say, I found this on my seed. Is this mold? Because it can look a little moldy with all the little hairs growing out. It is not mold, they're root hairs, right? And the purpose of these root hairs is to increase the surface area. So especially when a seed is just starting out, right, it needs to find resources. And what better way to find resources than to increase the area that you are searching in by growing these very numerous root hairs. All right, so that was the roots. Now we're going to switch to the other system, the shoot system, which has the stems and the leaves. Right? And together, right, the shoot system really plays an important role in resource acquisition and reproduction. Right? So follow it. And so we're going to start by talking about the stems. Right? Stems are important. Right? They can hold up parts of the plant. Right? But they can also help acquire resources. Right? They can help with resource acquisition, so maybe you need to search out some sunlight. The stems can orient the plant and the leaves of the plant towards that sunlight so it can use those resources. So for example, we have this potted plant here. You see there's a window in the corner, and those stems are orienting those leaves towards the sun so it can use the sunlight for photosynthesis. Okay. Normally the stems themselves do not photosynthesize, right? They don't make sugars. But sometimes they can, right? There are plants out there where these stems are specialized to undergo photosynthesis. These two examples here are great examples. They're more of the succulent species. This is like a prickly pear species. Right? In this case, these stems are the main photosynthetic organ, right? Instead of the leaves. Right? Not always the case, more rare to find this, right? But in those plants, like the prickly pear, they actually play a huge role in photosynthesis. Right? Because these plants don't have the traditional leaves that you might think of to acquire that sunlight. The stems also play a role in showcasing reproductive structures. Right? So we have our stems taking up our flowers, showcasing those flowers, advertising them to all those pollinators out there. So come see me, come pollinate me. Right? So they're showcasing those reproductive structures. Think of these coneflower plants here. They're pretty, but if these flowers were maybe towards the base of plants, they're not going to be super obvious. Pollinators might not find them as easily. Right? So stems are playing an important role in that part as well. All right, leaves, the other part of our shoot system here. Leaves are the main photosynthetic organ. Right? Leaves perform photosynthesis, so turning sunlight into sugars. We'll get into the more specifics of that process next week, but for now, we're just going to talk about leaves as photosynthesizing. Right? So leaves, they will go through photosynthesis, right, which is the fixation of CO2 into photosynthates. Right? Let's break down that definition. Right? Fixing of CO2. So basically, CO2 is entering the plants, right? That carbon, that plant is taking that carbon and taking it away from CO2 and putting it into another molecule like glucose. And glucose is the product of photosynthesis, so we would call it a photosynthate. Right? So basically, photosynthesis, you're fixing carbon, taking carbon from the air, and putting it into a molecule that plants can utilize. But beyond photosynthesis, and part of photosynthesis is gas exchange. Right? Plants have to be able to take in CO2 as a gas into their leaves in order for photosynthesis to occur. Right? But also a product of photosynthesis is going to be oxygen. Right? So they have to be able to release that oxygen back into the air. And so they do this by these openings on their leaves called stomata. More about those later on. Right? But leaves, we're photosynthesizing. Right? It's kind of like the powerhouse organ of these plants. All right, a lot of terminology in a short amount of time. Let's take a step back, and I just want you to review what we've learned, and then look at these images and speculate as to which function each plant organ is performing. There could be several plant organs present. So talk with your neighbor, come up with some ideas here. More geared towards insects. All right, let's talk about these images here. Like I said, there might be more than one function represented in each image. Let's talk about the first one. Right, we have this nice cacti species here. Right. First of all, what organ are we looking at? Yeah, yeah, it's the stem. And what is the stem doing in this case? Yeah, yeah. In this case, we're looking at the stem, right? The stem, as a great indicator, is green, meaning typically we could assume it's photosynthesizing. In this case, the stem is playing a main role in photosynthesis. Right? And you might also notice there are spikes on the plant, right? And when we didn't talk about it, yes, spikes are used for protection, right? And these spikes, they're actually the leaves of the plants, right? They're modified leaves. Which is not the type of leaf you might think of when you think about a leaf, right? Can anybody else come up with something different? Could have maybe thought of water storage. I mean, some plants like to store water in their stems as well. We didn't really talk about it. We do it. What about this middle image here? I'm really having you look at the base of this tree here, but what did we discuss for this image? Yeah. Yeah, yeah. The roots, they're anchoring the tree. All right, this is a really obvious example here. The roots are really spreading out and anchoring that tree into place. Did anybody talk about anything different? Yeah, nutrient uptake. Yeah, their roots. That's what they do. Yeah, very nice. And then this last image here, this is a trout lily, so a plant that's very common in the springtime around here. What organ did we talk about for this image? Yeah, there's a flower. What does the flower do? Yeah, for pollination. Yeah, Marcy, did we have something different? Okay, yeah. There is a second organ here. What is it? Leaves, yes, leaves. And what are the leaves doing? What is their primary function? Photosynthesis. Yeah, photosynthesis and gas exchange. Yes. I really like having you dissect images like this because I think it helps you put concepts into practice. Any questions? All right, we're going to move on to the next level of organization here would be tissues. Right? So tissues are groupings of cells that perform some sort of common function or some specialized function. Right? You're probably going to be the least familiar with the tissues of a plant if you've never taken anything that's plant biology related in class before. When we think about plant tissues, we can break them down into three main types. And we'll go over each of these in more detail here. But we have dermal tissues, vascular tissues, and ground tissues. Right? They each play a very important function for the plant. Right? I like this image here because everything is color-coded. Right? We see the dermal tissue is in white, vascular tissue is purple, and that ground tissue is yellow. You might notice that there's quite a bit of yellow represented there. Ground tissue tends to be pretty prominent in a plant. We're going to start by talking about the dermal tissues. Right? So the dermal tissues are the outermost layer of cells on a plant, and it kind of performs like a protective covering of the plant. Right? You can think of it as kind of like the skin of the plant. Right? It's that outer covering of the plant. Right? So if we look at a leaf, right? And in this case we have basically broken a leaf in half and taken a peek inside of the leaf. So this would be like a cross section here. And the dermal tissues are going to be the tissues that are on the outermost edge of that cross section. Right? Again, kind of the skin of the leaves. Right? If we think about dermal tissues, often we'll be talking about the epidermis. And so the epidermis is very specifically that one layer of cells on the tops and the bottoms of the leaves, and that one layer of cells that totally surround the stems and totally surround the roots. Right? Typically only one layer thick here. But we can also talk about the cuticle. Now the cuticle is not a cell, right? So it's technically not part of a tissue, but we try to clump it in with dermal tissue because it directly plays a role in protecting the plant. The cuticle is this waxy layer that's on top of our epidermal cells. And this waxy layer is going to help prevent the water from losing, or the plant from losing too much water. Right? So it's this waxy substance that prevents water loss. So then, let's see what would be a good analogy here. It would be like we have our skin, which would be the epidermis, and then we put a glove on top of it, right? That extra layer of protection here. If you've ever worn surgical gloves or latex gloves, you might notice that if you sweat inside of them, you get the water stays and it gets really nasty inside of the glove, right? Same kind of concept is happening with the cuticle over top of the epidermis. We can have specialized epidermal cells. So 3 really common of those specialized epidermal cells. One are the root hairs that we talked about. Those root hairs are specialized to help the roots acquire more resources. Again, it's that epidermis, that single layer of cells, but they're just specialized to really long and thin. We can have trichomes, which if you look at a plant, it looks like little hairs often on a plant. Right? Some trichomes are just, they simply look like hairs. Right? They can act as an extra protective layer. You're an insect trying to eat the plant, you have to first get through that hairy layer first. In this image here, we actually have trichomes that have like a sticky substance to it. Right? If you think back to those carnivorous plants that I had mentioned in the previous lecture here, how they can have these sticky hairs that'll trap in insects. Right? Those are trichomes. Those are specialized epidermal cells and part of the dermal tissue. And finally, we can have guard cells. All right, so guard cells are found on leaves. We know that leaves perform photosynthesis, which means they have to take in CO2 and release oxygen. They need to have an opening to do so. Right? And that opening is the stomata, but the cells that surround the stomata, or surround that opening, are the guard cells. The guard cells are the ones that are controlling whether or not the stomata is open or closed. Right? So it's controlling how much CO2 can come in and how much oxygen can leave the plant. All right, our next tissue here is a vascular tissue. So vascular tissue really plays a role in moving substances throughout the plant. So water and nutrients need to be able to move throughout all the different cells. And the vascular tissues provide a method of transportation. Oftentimes these vascular tissues can be very rigid and very sturdy. So they can also help in structure, providing structure to the plant. If we look at the vascular tissue, right, and these might be terms that you've heard before, we see we have xylem and phloem. Right? Xylem cells, right, are typically going to be these larger cells if we're looking at a cross-section of a plant. So we've taken a stem and we basically cut it in half and are looking inside the stem here. The xylem tend to be these really large cells, right? And they mainly transport water through the plant, but they'll also transport some minerals and nutrients. The other type of cells that make up vascular tissue are phloem cells. They're going to be next to the xylem cells, but they're going to be much smaller. And so if we look at, say, this image up here, we see the xylem cells are very big. and the phloem cells are much smaller but adjacent to the xylem. Often when we make slides that show these cross sections, they'll be dyed so we can pick out the different types of cells. Xylem tends to show up red, and phloem tends to show up blue. All right, our last tissue is ground tissue. Like I said, ground tissue is the majority of the cells inside of a plant. And basically, it's defined as tissues that are not thermal tissues, they are not vascular tissues. Everything else in the plant. If, again, we're looking at a cross section here, so we cut the plant in half and are looking inside of it, we can see that when we talk about ground tissue, we might often see something called the pith, which is all the tissues that are internal to our vascular tissues. So our vascular tissues in this case are this ring that we see. Right? In this particular cross section, the xylem, again, they're the bigger cells here, but they're towards the inside. And the phloem are smaller, but towards the outside. But these are our vascular tissues. Everything inside of that would be the pith. Everything outside of that would be the cortex. All right. Ground tissue. What is the purpose of ground tissue? We seem to be pumping it in with everything other than dermal or vascular tissues. Right? But they do have very important functions. Right? They can provide support for the plant, right? So keep the plant standing upright. They can help in storage. Right? So ground tissues, a lot of times we're going to store a lot of things. If you think about the carrot, right? Most of the cells in carrots are going to be ground tissue storing nutrients. Ground tissue are part of cells that are responsible for photosynthesis. Right? So all the photosynthesizing cells would be ground tissues. And also short distance transport. Right? So I said the vascular tissues provide transport for water and nutrients. But when we're talking about vascular tissues, we're really thinking about maybe moving nutrients from like the roots all the way to the first leaves that we see on the tippy tops of the plant. Right? Very long distance. Relative to a short distance, here would be like cell to cell. Right? Very, very short distances. All right. As an overview here, right? Again, if we're looking at a cross section, we can find all three types of tissues. Dermal tissues is for protection. They're going to be found that one layer of cells around the edge. Vascular tissues provide means of transport. We often see groupings of vascular tissues in these bundles. And then the ground tissues can be all the other tissues. And I put on here, be able to label everything in an image. And I actually have a day set aside where we're going to go in the lab, you're going to look at slides, you're going to work through a worksheet to put these terms into practice. Because I know this is a lot of terminology. All right, I have a couple more class questions here. Again, time for us to kind of digest that material that we were just given. Asking you, giving you a cell type, but asking you what type of tissue would they be a part of. Cool. So, talk with your neighbor, discuss it out, let me know if you have questions so far. Well, that's pretty big hands-on activity. How big of a lecture on it? Because it's a video you will watch for a quiz before we do the hands-on activity. It's hard to get away with that talking about that. That's a lot of hands-on activity. Like speaking while typical. Yeah.
Well, I just remember when my TV class, I was taking a class, and I like expect Christmas if they're going to this Christmas songs and hearing, oh, that's a model. So when I walk up, there's a fake class.
But you can tell if it was real
Yeah,
based
yeah.
on the structure.
Yeah.
Some of those fake ones.
No, yeah. It's beautiful.
All right. So first question here, we are looking at xylem and phloem cells. They provide transportation of nutrients and water throughout the plant. What type of tissues would they be a part of? Vascular, yeah, vascular provides transport. The other type of cell we're looking at are mesophyll cells. Right? These are cells that very specifically function in performing photosynthesis. Right? What type of tissue would they fall under? Ground tissue, yeah. They're not providing transport, they're not providing that protection, right? They're providing everything else, which is ground. Any questions? All right. Now we're going to move on to the last little bit of our structure here, which is a fair amount of material to it as well. But we're going to talk about the cells now. Right? So we've gone from organs, which are groupings of tissues, to tissues, which are groupings of cells, and now we're going to talk about the cells themselves. All right. So if we look at plant cells, and I'm very much simplifying what is a cell here. If you've taken biology class in the past, you've probably gone more in depth than what I'm going to do here. But if we're looking at a cell, right, a cell is going to have a nucleus. Right? A nucleus is going to be typically pretty prominent in the plant, right? Pretty easy to spot. The nucleus houses the DNA. Right? So that's an easy thing to spot in a lot of cells is the nucleus. But beyond the nucleus, we also have a bunch of other things in a cell. Right? We have a bunch of other stuff going on here. Right? These are all called organelles. Right? They are membrane-bound compartments. Right? So they're housed within a membrane. Right? And they perform very specialized functions, very compartmentalized functions. We're not going to go into the inner workings of all the organelles in a cell, but we will talk about a few that are very specific to plants themselves. So organelles, maybe you've heard of, mitochondria. That's often one that people remember as the powerhouse of the cell. Right? We might have things like the Golgi apparatus or the peroxisome. Right? Again, we're not going to define those out individually. But if we look at plant cells themselves, right, and we'll talk about this in a bit too, there's a variety to them. They're not all going to look the same. There's going to be different sizes, different shapes. Some of them might lack a lot of these organelles. Right? Some of them might have all of the organelles. Some of them might only have bits and pieces. Right? It's going to differ between what plant species we're looking at and what function that cell needs to perform. All right. One of the things about cells, though, that we need to know is that all cells have a plasma membrane. Right? And so a plasma membrane, right, again, we're not going into too much detail here, but it will become important when we talk about taking up water and how water might move across membranes here. But all cells have a plasma membrane that we can also call a phospholipid bilayer. Right? So a phospholipid is this molecule in the corner here by itself. Right? It has what's called a head part and a tail part. Right? The tails are hydrophobic, which means they don't like interacting with water. Right? And so these tails often come together interact with each other, but they don't have to interact with the water inside or outside of the cell. Whereas the head part of our phospholipid molecule tends to be water loving, and doesn't mind being around water. They will orient themselves towards the outside of this plasma membrane. And so we get a phospholipid bilayer. And we basically have two layers of phospholipids, with the tails oriented towards each other. A phospholipid bilayer, another name for that, would be a plasma membrane. Right? They're basically used interchangeably here. But this plasma membrane is important because it can regulate what goes into and out of a cell. Right? So we don't want to let just everything into the cell. Things can be harmful. Maybe we might get too much of a good thing that can become toxic. We want to be able to regulate what goes in and what goes out. Right? The plasma membrane plays a huge role in that regulation. Right? The plasma membrane can also act as signaling. Right? We won't talk about that too much in this class here. But we might have these proteins embedded within a plasma membrane that can act as signaling, basically how the cells might talk to one another. Okay? So we are going to find these plasma membranes encasing the entire cell themselves, right? But also surrounding all of the organelles. Right? So organelles are those membrane-wide aligned compartments. That membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. We think about the anatomy of a cell. Like I said, we're not going to go into every single detail, but we are going to point out the key differences between a plant cell and an animal cell, because they are different. Right? If you look at our plant cell here, it tends to be a little bit more rigid in shape, right? Be more boxy, versus an animal cell that tends to be more circular, more round, more globular. And it's maybe a word you could use to describe it. Okay, but a plant cell is going to have key features that an animal cell does not. Okay. Those main differences is that a plant cell is going to have many chloroplasts. Okay. So we're going to have chloroplasts. That's an organelle. Okay. It's going to have a very large vacuole, also an organelle, and it's going to have a cell wall, which is not an organelle, but a structure surrounding our cell itself. Let's talk about chloroplasts first. So, chloroplasts. They are the organelle that is responsible for photosynthesis. Right? If a cell has a chloroplast organelle in it, that cell will perform photosynthesis, and photosynthesis is happening inside of this organelle, inside of the chloroplast. So it's here that we're converting that solar energy, so energy from the sun, into chemical energy, into sugars. Right? Sugars that the plants can use as part of their metabolism, essentially. Right? Chloroplasts tend to have many membranes, and we'll talk about this more in depth next week when we talk about photosynthesis. But there's a lot of membranes inside of the chloroplast, so each of these stacks are essentially stacks of membranes. And membranes are very important in the actual function, the details of photosynthesis. Okay. So plant cells have chloroplasts. Plant cells also have very large vacuoles. Okay. Now animal cells also have vacuoles, okay, but in plant cells, these vacuoles are much larger. Okay. So vacuoles are an organelle that's used for storage. Okay. We're going to store different molecules, and definitely store a lot of water inside of these vacuoles. These vacuoles, they're used for storage, but they can also use for these cells to help maintain their shape. Right? So if these vacuoles are full of water, right, they're pretty plump, right? If the water leaves and is not replaced, they might start to shrivel, and that cell itself might kind of become more wilted, right, essentially. So if we have a full vacuole, we're going to have a nice shape of our cell. It helps maintain. That's a large vacuole because they don't move. All right, they can't walk and find some other resources elsewhere. Right? Basically, they're going to hoard their resources and store it in these vacuoles. So if there becomes a point in the growing season, maybe it's not raining as much, they can rely on stored water or stored nutrients inside of these vacuoles. Right? Whereas an animal, if their watering hole dries up, they can find another one. Right? Plants can't do that. So they store a lot in some of these very large vacuoles. All right, the last difference we'll talk about here are that plants have a cell wall. This is not an organelle, but rather a structure that surrounds our cell. So we would say it's an extracellular structure. Basically outside of the cell. Like here we have our plasma membrane. And on the bottom of this plasma membrane would be the inside of our cell. But outside of the plasma membrane, we have our cell wall. This cell wall is really rigid. It's a structure that helps to maintain the cell shape, provides structural support to a plant, so it's kind of providing like a skeletal support system for the plant here. It can also help protect the plant. It can also help with things moving in and out of these cells. Now these cell walls are composed of the molecule cellulose. Cellulose and other proteins embedded in it as well. Primarily cellulose. The cellulose comes in these long fibers. My computer needs to be plugged in here. Comes in these long fibers, and if we look at the cellular structure, we would see a structure similar to what I'm showing you here. Very long fibers. They're kind of crisscrossing in that cell wall. You can kind of think of it as a weave, right? So like if you look at it like a fabric, right? You have all these fabrics interwoven with each other. Right? It's kind of the structure of a cell wall. These fibers that are interwoven with each other. All right. Well, we have these cell walls. But yes, it does get more complicated than that. Some plants will have a singular cell wall. Right? We would say that's the primary cell wall. It tends to be rigid, but yet flexible. But other plants have a secondary cell wall. So they might have one cell wall. Other plants might have an additional cell wall. Well, this secondary cell wall, it's in between the primary cell wall and the inside of the cell. And this one is generally going to be more stiff. Right? We tend to find these cells that have two cell walls in areas of the plant that need to have more structure. Right? So maybe in the woody parts of a plant or in the stem. Right? They need more structure to hold up other parts of the plant, to hold up those leaves, to keep that plant upright. We might see that they have a secondary cell wall to help them stay more rigid, to provide that more that additional support. Now, even though these plants have these cell walls that are surrounding the cell itself, they need to have a way to talk to one another or exchange nutrients and molecules with one another. And that's done through plasmodesmata. Right? They're basically like these channels that you can find linking cells together. They have plasma membrane lining their channels, and they're a way that these cells can communicate with one another. All right, I have a quick question here for review, because again, I gave you a lot of information. I have one section after this, right? But why might cells need larger vacuoles? And then if we look at this image, can you determine which one is a good cell? Alright, I gave you less time here because these were quite as difficult of questions as the other slides. Why might a plant need a larger vacuole? What does it need to do? Yeah. They gotta store resources, so they have these very large vacuoles. And then I gave you two images of cells here. Which one is the plant cell? The right or the left? Yeah, the right one. Why do we know that one's the plant cell? Yeah, it has this really large vacuole. What else could you have used to determine that it's a plant cell? Yeah, it has this cell wall, right? And it tends to be more like in that boxy shape, right? That's a good telltale sign that it's a plant cell. It's really boxy, it's really rigid, has that cell wall. And also there's this really large vacuole. Yeah. Any questions? Alright, we're going to talk about specific cells now. And we get to the part of plant biology that contain my favorite words, right? Parenchyma, conchymon, sclerenchyma. I think they're just so fun to say. But we have different types of cells in a plant, right? Not all cells are going to be the same. Just like if you play a sport, right, the ball that you are going to use is going to be different for every sport depending on what you need to do with it, right? So we're going to have these different cells that are going to perform different functions. So we're going to talk about meristematic cells. We're going to talk about parenchyma, sclerenchyma, and collenchyma. We're also going to talk about water-conducting cells and sugar-conducting cells. But we're going to start with these meristems. So meristems are going to be regions of the plant where the cells don't quite yet have a specialized function. Right? So it's going to be an area of undifferentiated tissue, meaning that the tissue doesn't have a function. The cells yet don't have a function. Instead, in this area of the plant, these cells are going to be actively dividing and producing more cells. Now, eventually, those cells that are produced, they're going to grow, they're going to elongate, they're going to essentially mature, and then they will be given some sort of a function. They will become differentiated. Now, what that function is going to depend on maybe where this meristematic tissue is located and maybe what the cell needs or what the plant needs that cell to do. Right? It could be things like transporting water and nutrients. It could be photosynthesizing. It could be producing these spines and thorns for protection. Right? But meristematic cells, you just don't yet have that function. Now, there's two different regions we can find meristems. Right? We can broadly say that we can find apical meristems and lateral meristems. Apical meristems are going to be located on the tips of the plants, right? The tips that are actively growing. So they're going to be responsible for something called primary growth. And so primary growth, you can think of it as an increase in height, right? Or maybe an increase in width if you're a really bushy plant. Right? Actively growing up and down, maybe lengthwise. Right? It's going to be everything that's growing that's not woody. Right? Woody growth is part of the lateral nerve cells. So primary growth is just new growth up and down. Right? We would have our apical meristems. They'd be located at the very tips of that new growth. Right? I have an image on the next slide that better illustrates this. Or it might be on the very tip of a stem where new leaves are being produced. Maybe it's the tip of a root. This is different from the lateral meristems, which we're not going to spend too much time talking about because we're really not looking at a lot of woody plants in this class. Woody plants pose an additional challenge to grow in space. They tend to grow, need longer to grow. They're going to take up more room. We're not really going to focus on them. Right? But they are good examples of lateral meristems. Right? And these are meristems that are going to be responsible for secondary growth or growth of wood, or woody structures. Right? So increases in the width of like a stem, or the trunk of a tree. Right? So that primary growth, like I said, is going to be growth up and down. It's going to increase in height. You're going to find them at the shoot tips, right, where the leaves are being actively produced, but also the root tips. And if you remember, the roots has many branches to them, lots of lateral roots. All of those lateral roots, at the tips of those lateral roots, will also have apical nerve cells. Yeah.
Is apex of the root, is it root or the bottom?
It's like this little area in between the two here. Yeah, it's kind of hard to see. Actually, this is a hard one to conceptualize because it's at the tip of the stem. I'm gonna go back a slide here. Here we go. And if you really zoom in on the tip of the stem, you will see how nerve stem here is really being actively produced. Does that answer your question? Yeah, that one's a harder one to see. All right, so we also have all these other types of plant cells. And first year I taught this, I went into depth in all of these plant cells. I don't think it's necessary for your knowledge of space plants to know every single detail of these. So I'm going to give you an overview of the different types of plant cells we can find. We're going to start by talking about parenchyma cells. Parenchyma cells are going to perform metabolic functions like photosynthesis. Right? They're also going to be responsible for storage, right, or synthesis of other materials. Right? So parenchyma cells, I got some transitions on that stuff here. Parenchyma cells are going to be found in like the ground tissue. Right? So we're looking at a cross section again, looking at the red arrows here. Right? In the middle here we have our pith. Oftentimes we're storing materials here. On the outside, right, maybe we have cells that might perform photosynthesis, particularly in leaves. Right? Those would be parenchyma cells. Parenchyma cells are going to be cells that provide support for tissues that are actively growing. Right? So that might be, I think in the video it mentions like celery. Right? If you eat celery and you have the strings of the celery, right, those are groupings of parenchyma cells that providing the structure to that celery stalk. Right? Another classic example are the petioles of the leaves. So if you take leaves off a tree, it's like that little stem at the end of the leaf there. They're filled with these parenchyma cells because they're tissues that are actively growing. Right? It's providing support. Right? So particularly in leaves, right, they have to be flexible. They have to be able to move. Right? Because we're going to have wind blowing through the leaves. Those petioles are going to be moving those leaves around. So it has to have that support, but also the flexibility in those cells. So support for growing tissues. Right? We might see them as clumps kind of on the edges of our cross sections here. This one's always a little bit harder to distinguish in a cross section. So this might be, say if this was a celery cross section, this might be those strings, right, of the celery. That's different from sclerenchyma cells. Right? Sclerenchyma cells also provide strength and support, but they're in mature parts of the plants that are no longer growing. Right? They can be in the form of these like fibers. Right? We often see these fibers in a lot of seed coats. Right? If you eat a pear, right, it's kind of like gritty. Right? That grit that you're feeling when you're eating a pear is actually sclerenchyma cells. Right? They're called sclerids in the pears, providing support for that fruit, right, to keep it nice and plump and appealing for humans, but also for other animals to come along and eat it and help support its seeds. Right? So parenchyma, support for growing tissues. Parenchyma, support for tissues that are mature, no longer growing. The last two we'll talk about here, right, are what we kind of previously mentioned, would be xylem and phloem. Or we could say water conducting cells, which are xylem. Xylem are going to provide ways for water to move around. Like I said before, water, but also some dissolved nutrients, mostly water. If we look at the xylem here, again, we're looking at these vascular bundles. The xylem tends to be the bigger ones. You can see those bigger xylem cells within the entire vascular bundle. Now, the sugar conducting cells would be the phloem. They transport water and nutrients, but mostly nutrients. They're really used to move nutrients around in the plant. And here's my arrow. And so the phloem, again, we're in our vascular structure, tends to be those smaller cells. Xylem tends to move water in one direction, so from like the roots to the leaves, whereas phloem can move sugars and water in many directions. So they can move it from where they are stored to where they are needed. And that tends to be another major difference between how they function. Now, both of these types of cells tend to be like columnar shaped. We might have vessel elements in xylem here, and tracheids. So they're columnar in shape, so kind of like the plumbing of the plant. But they all have these porous plates at the ends of their cells that connect them together that allow for water to move from one tracheid or one xylem cell to another xylem cell. Yeah?
Can you repeat where you say designing, which one transports from water to
That would be xylem. So xylem transports water in one direction only. And phloem transports water nutrients wherever it needs to be. Alright, I don't have a review slide here, but rather I just want to end with homework for tomorrow. We'll do a 15-minute break and then we'll come back and start our discussion for our endurance book. So homework for tomorrow, again, I have a couple of videos for you to watch. Same as before, they go into a lot of detail. You know, I'm going to test you in some very broad subjects, not every single detail. This video here tends to be pretty long. I'm only asking you to watch roughly 3-4 minutes of it here. But you can watch roughly if you want. Let's see. Exam, that is going to be changed to Monday. I thought I had changed that. I think I changed it on your slides to say Friday, but it still says Thursday in mine. That'll be changed to Monday, right? And then as we're looking even forward into the future here, the next endurance chapters will be a week from today. Next Tuesday will be chapters 6 through 13. I do have more slides at the end of this that kind of elaborate on some of the cell types. Feel free to look through them. I will not test you in that detail. Oh, test up, yep. I changed around the ordering of my lecture, so I had to change the homework. I must have saved it on mine, but not on yours. I will go and delete the one that you don't need to worry about.
So
Yes. Let me take a look.
Okay.
Let me take a look. Yeah, I'll delete the one off of your slide that you don't need to know about. I apologize. I thought I had done that. I might be incorrect on my slides, but there's still going to be 2 things for you to either watch or read. All right. Any questions? All right, let's take a 15-minute break. Let's come back at like 11:55, and we'll do our endurance discussion.
Oh gosh. I know where there is one. It's by the steamery, way on the other end of the building. That's a pretty neat one. Okay, sounds good. I know about that one. I feel like there's one on the first floor, like directly below us. I'm not positive.
We'll find it.
All right.
You guys can do this outside, we just want to put up the map.
It is the slide where you have to be confident. Thank you for pointing that out.